When most people think of a king or queen, they imagine grandeur, golden thrones, flowing robes, glittering crowns, and endless celebrations. Now, imagine all of that being handed to a child, sometimes as young as 6, 7, or 10. It seems like a story out of a fairy tale, yet history tells a far darker, more complicated truth. For centuries, child monarchs ruled kingdoms across the world, but the reality behind their crowns was rarely as glamorous as the history books or paintings suggest. Take, for instance, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun of Egypt. Modern depictions often show him as a serene, almost playful boy adorned with gold and jewels. But behind the iconic mask and carefully curated images lay a child forced into the deadly, politically charged world of Egyptian royalty. Tutankhamun ascended the throne at around 8 or 9 years old, a time when most children are still learning basic skills, yet he was expected to navigate the complex machinery of a kingdom, participate in ceremonial rituals, and command respect from seasoned advisors and generals. In short, he was a child with the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders, often relying entirely on adults whose intentions were not always pure. This stark contrast between perception and reality is common across the ages. In medieval Europe, for example, young monarchs were often surrounded by an aura of romanticized innocence. Paintings and literature depicted child kings and queens as miniature adults, already wise beyond their years. Yet behind those serene depictions lay isolation, strict routines, and constant supervision. These children had almost no freedom, living lives dictated by tutors, courtiers, and regents, often removed from other children of their age. Their daily existence could be more rigid and controlled than any military academy or boarding school we know today. The myth of the pampered, protected child ruler is tempting because it allows us to romanticize history. We want to imagine that these children, though young, wielded power effortlessly, orchestrated diplomatic relations, and ruled justly. However, surviving contemporary letters, diaries, and court records often paint a far more disturbing picture. Many child monarchs suffered from chronic stress, anxiety, and even depression. They were expected to make critical decisions, often under threat of rebellion or betrayal, all while trying to understand the very adult concepts of law, taxation, and warfare. Even the smallest misstep could have catastrophic consequences. Take Henry VI of England, who became king at just 9 months old. Though he obviously could not rule, the regency government governing in his name faced constant factional infighting. Henry's childhood was dominated not by play or learning but by navigating a court filled with intrigue and distrust, his future manipulated and debated by nobles who cared little for his well-being. By the time he reached adolescence, the seeds of political instability sown during his early years had already begun to unravel his reign. The lesson is clear: being a monarch as a child was not just difficult, it could be life-threatening. Interestingly, the physical environment of royal courts often compounded the psychological toll. Palaces, though magnificent, were not welcoming homes for children. They were centers of surveillance, ceremony, and rigid hierarchy. In many cases, young rulers were closely watched not only by adults but also by servants, guards, and spies, leaving almost no privacy or personal space. Every action, every word could be scrutinized and interpreted as a sign of weakness or strength. In this environment, innocence was a liability. Naivety could be exploited, and the child's natural impulsiveness was often punished harshly. Another common misconception is that child rulers were universally loved or adored. Public sentiment did not always favor their reign, especially if they were perceived as weak or easily manipulated. Propaganda, rumors, and political maneuvering could turn the populace against a child king or queen, further isolating them from the very subjects they were supposed to lead. A young ruler's life, in many ways, was a constant battle to prove competence, even while lacking the experience, maturity, or autonomy to do so fully. Yet, despite these harsh realities, child monarchs were sometimes able to forge deep bonds with certain trusted advisors or family members. Tutoring and mentorship could provide both guidance and emotional support, though it was rare and often conditional on the political agendas of adults. These relationships could shape a child's worldview, their strategies for leadership, and, ultimately, their survival. However, such guidance was often a double-edged sword. The adults meant to protect and educate could also manipulate, deceive, or control the child for their own gain. Even leisure and childhood joys were highly controlled. Games, storytelling, and personal hobbies existed, but only within limits approved by regents and tutors. Unlike other children, who explored and experimented freely, young monarchs' curiosities were channeled toward activities that reinforced political education or ceremonial duties. Misbehavior could carry far more serious consequences than ordinary childhood mischief, sometimes even threatening life or throne. In short, the childhood of kings and queens was anything but ordinary. It was a life of contradictions, immense privilege paired with immense responsibility, ceremonial beauty paired with constant surveillance, education paired with psychological strain. The world outside the palace walls might have viewed these children as symbols of power and continuity, yet within the gilded halls, they often faced loneliness, manipulation, and a heavy burden of expectation. By understanding the stark differences between myth and reality, we begin to see the true complexity of historical child rulers. These were children not only growing up fast but also forced to navigate a world where one misstep could cost them their throne, or even their life. The story of childhood kings and queens is, in many ways, a story of survival, a young life overshadowed by power, danger, and expectation, yet sometimes capable of astonishing resilience and cunning. The contrast between the public image and private reality sets the stage for the rest of our exploration. From ascension and regency councils to the emotional toll and political intrigues, we are about to uncover the hidden, often shocking truth behind the crowns. This is not just history, it is the dark and compelling story of children forced to become rulers before they were ready to understand what ruling truly meant. The ascension of a child to a throne was rarely a matter of choice. It was almost always a consequence of fate, tragedy, or ruthless politics. Unlike adults, whose rise could be planned, negotiated, or earned through conquest, children became monarchs because of circumstances beyond their control. Understanding how and why children inherited kingdoms is essential to grasp the precariousness of their reigns and the hidden dangers they faced behind palace walls. One of the most common reasons for child kings or queens was the sudden death of a parent. Royal families in pre-modern times faced high mortality rates due to disease, childbirth complications, and assassination. In England, for example, Edward VI became king at the age of 9 after the death of his father, Henry VIII. Edward's ascent was not a celebration of youthful promise, it was the unintended consequence of dynastic survival. Suddenly, an innocent child found himself thrust into the center of a deadly political chessboard, where adults maneuvered for power while his understanding of the world remained limited to lessons from tutors and regents. But death was not the only pathway to youthful rule. In some cases, political crises or contested successions forced nobles and clergy to place a child on the throne as a compromise candidate. A child could be seen as safe, someone malleable, who could not yet act independently, yet whose royal bloodline satisfied factions vying for legitimacy. Louis XIV of France, for instance, became king at the age of 4 after the death of his father, Louis XIII. The regency that followed was dominated by his mother, Anne of Austria, and the cunning Cardinal Mazarin, who used the boy's youth as a tool to maintain control while consolidating their own power. For centuries, historians have debated whether Louis truly ruled as a child or whether the regency simply set the stage for his legendary absolute monarchy later in life. Either way, the path to power had been paved not by ambition, but by circumstance. Inheritance laws played an equally significant role. Many monarchies adhered to strict primogeniture, meaning that the eldest male, or in some cases, the eldest child, automatically inherited the throne, regardless of age. This system valued bloodlines over maturity, making it inevitable that children would occasionally find themselves crowned. In medieval Europe, the pressure to maintain dynastic continuity often outweighed practical considerations. Parents and nobles alike viewed a child's succession not as a burden but as a necessity for the stability of the realm, even if that child was barely old enough to speak in public or hold a scepter without assistance. Yet the mere fact of being crowned did not equate to actual control. This is where regency councils became pivotal, for good or ill. A child monarch, by definition, lacked the capacity to rule independently, and adults, sometimes loving, often ambitious, stepped in to govern in their stead. These regents were supposed to guide and protect, but history shows that regency was just as often a platform for manipulation and personal gain. Tsar Ivan IV of Russia, famously known as Ivan the Terrible, inherited the throne at 3 years old. His early years were dominated by power struggles among boyars, Russian nobles, who sought to control him while he was still a child. The chaos of his youth left lasting scars, ultimately shaping him into one of history's most notorious rulers. In many ways, Ivan's tragic early life highlights the inherent danger of placing a child at the center of political machinations. Accidental ascensions were another pathway. Epidemics, wars, and violent purges could suddenly wipe out adult heirs, leaving the youngest child as the next in line. This unpredictability meant that even a previously overlooked or fragile member of a royal family could find themselves crowned overnight. The story of Mary, Queen of Scots, is a stark example. She became queen at just 6 days old after the death of her father, James V of Scotland. Mary's childhood was shaped by the awareness that she was a pawn in the deadly games of regents, nobles, and foreign powers. Her very existence was political, her infancy a stage on which larger forces played out their ambitions. In some cultures, children were deliberately installed as monarchs during turbulent times. By placing a child on the throne, adults could neutralize conflicts among rival factions. A young ruler was malleable, unlikely to take sides independently, and could serve as a unifying symbol while the real power rested elsewhere. This practice was common in many dynastic empires, including China and Japan, where young emperors frequently ruled under the supervision of regents, empresses, or councils. These child monarchs became figureheads, their youth exploited to maintain political equilibrium, often at the cost of their autonomy and well-being. Even when child rulers survived the treacherous early years, the conditions of their ascension often set a tone of instability that followed them into adulthood. Being crowned as a child meant entering a world where power, trust, and survival were intertwined. Allies could turn into enemies overnight, regents could betray or manipulate, and public opinion could shift with alarming speed. The lesson across centuries is consistent: the circumstances that bring a child to power often dictate the challenges they will face throughout their reign, shaping both their rule and their psyche. The hidden truth is that ascending the throne as a child was rarely about readiness, wisdom, or competence. It was about lineage, circumstance, and the strategic interests of adults. Dynasties survived at the expense of childhood, and children became symbols, pawns, and sometimes victims of political necessity. Every coronation of a child monarch carried with it the weight of intrigue, danger, and an uncertain future, laying the foundation for the complex and often tragic stories that would unfold over the years. By understanding these paths to power, we start to see why the lives of child monarchs were fraught with tension, fear, and constant vigilance. Their childhoods were not mere stepping stones to adult rule, they were the battlefield upon which the fortunes of kingdoms were fought and often lost. In the next section, we will uncover how the adults surrounding these children, advisors, regents, and sometimes parents, exercised real power, shaping the destiny of nations while their young sovereigns remained mostly observers, trapped in a gilded cage of authority and expectation. Once a child ascended to the throne, the reality of power shifted immediately, not toward the young monarch, but to the adults who surrounded them. Regency councils, advisors, and sometimes even parents became the real rulers, shaping the kingdom in ways that served their own ambitions rather than the crown itself. While history remembers the names of kings and queens, it often obscures the shadowy figures behind them, the puppet masters who pulled the strings of empires through the fragile hands of children. Take, for example, the case of Louis XIV of France. Crowned at the tender age of 4, Louis's early reign was entirely controlled by his mother, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. To the world, the boy king represented continuity and divine right, yet Mazarin's influence dictated almost every decision in the kingdom. Historians note that while Louis would later become the Sun King, the stability of France during his early years owed more to the cunning political maneuvering of his advisors than to the young monarch himself. Mazarin's guidance, however, was far from purely benevolent. It was a balancing act of manipulation, control, and self-preservation, designed to cement his own authority while ensuring the young king remained a symbol rather than a threat. Regents often occupied a dangerous moral gray zone. Some genuinely sought to mentor and protect their young charges, while others exploited them. The regent's power was absolute in many respects. They controlled the treasury, commanded armies, and shaped foreign policy. For a child monarch, this could mean that the line between guidance and coercion was virtually invisible. Edward VI of England, crowned at 9, provides a stark example. The young king was guided by a council dominated by Edward Seymour, his uncle and Lord Protector. Seymour's initial intention may have been to stabilize the realm during Edward's minority, yet ambition and greed quickly overshadowed paternal guidance. Eventually, Seymour's overreach led to his execution, highlighting how regents themselves were embroiled in deadly power struggles, with the child monarch caught in the middle. This dynamic created a peculiar form of imprisonment for child rulers. Though they occupied the highest position in the land, their authority was largely ceremonial until they reached the age of majority. Every decision, from taxation to warfare, required oversight or approval. Even seemingly minor choices, such as selecting a tutor or arranging a marriage, were dictated. The royal treasury, state lands, and appointments could be siphoned off, with the child ruler none the wiser. For instance, in the French kingdom under Louis XIV's minority, Mazarin's administration leveraged the king's name to enforce taxes and fund wars, simultaneously consolidating power for themselves. The child's crown became a tool, and their image a shield against public scrutiny. After all, who could challenge a boy king without risking accusations of disloyalty or impiety? Yet, puppet masters were not always malicious. Some genuinely attempted to mentor their wards, navigating the treacherous currents of court politics while safeguarding the young monarch's future. Akbar the Great of India, for example, ascended to the throne at 13 after the death of his father. His early advisors provided guidance, strategy, and education in governance, diplomacy, and military affairs. In Akbar's case, the influence of wise regents allowed him to grow into one of history's most celebrated rulers. However, such success stories were exceptions rather than the rule. More often, the child's autonomy was sacrificed, and their reign became an arena for adult ambition. The danger of regency was amplified in politically unstable kingdoms. In England during the Wars of the Roses, Edward V, crowned at 12, found himself effectively imprisoned by his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard, nominally a protector, maneuvered to secure the throne for himself, ultimately declaring Edward and his brother illegitimate. The boys disappeared from historical record, presumed murdered, a stark illustration of how regents and advisors could transform mentorship into deadly opportunism. For child monarchs, trust was a liability, and the adults surrounding them could be both guardians and executioners. The interplay between regents and child rulers also shaped public perception. In many cultures, the child monarch was a symbol of continuity and divine favor, while the adults pulling the strings remained invisible to the masses. This separation allowed puppet masters to exercise near-complete control while maintaining the illusion of stability. It was a delicate balancing act: show enough competence to reassure subjects, yet keep the child's innocence intact enough to justify adult oversight. Any misstep could spark rebellion, undermine legitimacy, or invite foreign intervention. Ultimately, the story of puppet masters reveals that power in the hands of a child was both potent and perilous, but rarely in the child's control. Behind every young monarch were adults whose ambitions, fears, and strategies shaped kingdoms, wars, and dynasties. Some guided wisely, some manipulated ruthlessly, and some exploited their wards for wealth and influence. For the child king or queen, growing up meant navigating not only the challenges of rulership but also the very human complexities of trust, betrayal, and manipulation, lessons that would leave lasting marks on both their reigns and their psyches. As we move forward in our exploration, we will step inside the daily life of these young rulers, revealing what it was truly like to exist in gilded halls under constant observation, burdened with ceremonial duties, and surrounded by advisors whose hands both guided and controlled them. The contrast between visible power and hidden manipulation underscores one of the central truths of child monarchs: they may wear the crown, but they rarely hold the reins. Life behind palace walls was a world apart from the bustling streets, fields, and villages of the kingdoms that child monarchs were supposed to rule. While history often depicts them in ceremonial grandeur, draped in silks, adorned with jewels, seated on golden thrones, the reality was far more confining, regimented, and psychologically taxing. For child kings and queens, every day was a performance, every moment watched, and every action judged, creating a strange mix of luxury, isolation, and pressure that few could comprehend. From the moment a child monarch awoke, their day was dictated by protocol. Unlike ordinary children, whose mornings might begin with play or chores, young rulers followed strict schedules designed to instill discipline, prepare them for governance, and impress court visitors. Tutors and regents oversaw lessons in languages, law, military strategy, and etiquette, often from sunrise to sunset. Even play was educational. Games were designed to teach tactics, problem-solving, or social diplomacy. The very concept of free time was foreign, and childhood innocence was subordinated to the demands of monarchy. Consider the young Mary, Queen of Scots, who ascended to the throne as an infant and spent her early years surrounded by regents and tutors. Her days were filled with lessons in Latin, history, and governance, often in environments suffused with tension and intrigue. She rarely saw other children her age, and friendships were limited by the constant presence of servants and advisors. Loneliness was a frequent companion. Despite living in palaces of opulence, she experienced the emotional deprivation common to many child monarchs. Even ordinary routines, such as meals, were loaded with ceremonial weight. Dining was a public affair, attended by courtiers, nobles, and foreign emissaries. Every gesture, posture, and word could be interpreted as a signal of authority, intelligence, or weakness. Eating in privacy was a luxury few could enjoy, and mistakes could be met with criticism, ridicule, or political consequences. For a child, simply existing within these spaces was an education in constant vigilance, a lesson in survival as much as governance. The emotional impact of this life cannot be overstated. Young monarchs learned early that appearances mattered more than feelings. Tutoring, though rigorous, was also a tool of control. Tutors often acted as intermediaries between the child and the adult world, filtering information and shaping the child's understanding of events. A young ruler might be shielded from certain truths, manipulated to favor one faction, or educated in a manner that reinforced the regent's power. Over time, this created a dual reality. The child understood the world only as the adults around them allowed, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation, fear, and confusion. Isolation extended to the palace's physical layout. Many child monarchs were kept in quarters separated from servants or other children, limiting social interaction. Playgrounds and gardens existed, but access was restricted. When Louis XIV was a child, for instance, the Louvre's corridors and gardens were more training grounds than playgrounds. Courtiers observed every step, and even leisure activities were structured. Personal expression was limited, as deviation from expected behavior could be perceived as immaturity, or worse, incompetence. Even ceremonial duties could become a source of stress. Coronations, public audiences, religious observances, and festivals were not merely symbolic, they were tests of composure and legitimacy. A child who faltered in public risked not only embarrassment but also the perception of weakness that could embolden rivals. The young Tsar Peter I of Russia, later known as Peter the Great, spent his childhood navigating ceremonies, inspections, and the formalities of court, all under the gaze of regents and foreign dignitaries. These experiences shaped his understanding of power, diplomacy, and image management, but they also imposed psychological burdens that few adults could fully bear. Health and comfort were similarly constrained by court life. While palaces offered warmth, food, and protection from the outside world, they were not necessarily places of wellness. Hygiene was limited, diets were often ceremonial rather than nutritious, and disease could spread quickly. A child monarch could be subjected to harsh disciplinary practices or forced to endure conditions that would be considered extreme for adults. The combination of expectation, observation, and limited autonomy created both physical and emotional stress that would leave lasting marks. Interestingly, child monarchs often learned early to mask their emotions. Expressions of fear, anger, or frustration could be exploited by advisors or enemies. Letters and diaries from young rulers like Elizabeth I reveal attempts to navigate a world in which even personal sentiment could be dangerous. A smile could be read as cunning, a frown as weakness. Living under constant observation transformed simple human reactions into political statements, further blurring the line between childhood and adulthood. Despite these pressures, moments of human warmth did exist, though they were often fleeting. Trusted advisors, tutors, or family members sometimes provided genuine affection, and small acts of kindness or play offered temporary respite. Yet the overarching reality remained: palaces were arenas of control, ceremonial obligation, and scrutiny. Childhood, as we understand it, was largely absent, replaced by a complex blend of spectacle, duty, and survival. Understanding the daily life of child monarchs reveals why many struggled with mental health, trust, and identity later in life. The combination of isolation, relentless observation, and the expectation of maturity created conditions that shaped not only their reigns but their personalities. Life behind palace walls was a gilded prison, luxurious in appearance but restrictive, isolating, and psychologically demanding. As we continue our exploration, we will see how these pressures compounded with other dangers, illness, political intrigue, and rebellion, to make the life of a child monarch not just challenging, but often perilous. The story of daily life behind palace walls is essential to understanding the broader, darker truths of youthful reigns, where privilege and peril existed side by side in a world of constant expectation. For child monarchs, the crown came with a burden few adults could imagine, and one that extended far beyond political intrigue: the fragility of youth itself. In an era before modern medicine, vaccines, or even basic sanitation, the lives of young rulers were precarious. Disease, malnutrition, injury, and psychological stress were constant threats, making childhood already dangerous, and monarchy exponentially more so. In many cases, the early deaths of rulers reshaped entire kingdoms and altered the course of history. Even within the gilded walls of a palace, a child monarch's health was never guaranteed. Infant and childhood mortality rates were alarmingly high across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis swept through courts just as they did villages. While wealth provided some protection, better nutrition, access to physicians, and private quarters, it could not guarantee survival. Tutankhamun, crowned around the age of 8, suffered from a variety of physical ailments, likely exacerbated by genetic conditions and the stress of rulership. He died around 18, leaving historians to speculate how much his role as pharaoh, combined with frail health, contributed to his early demise. Medical knowledge for children, particularly rulers, was rudimentary at best. Physicians relied on bloodletting, herbal remedies, and spiritual interventions, often causing more harm than good. The pressure to maintain appearances also influenced treatment. Child monarchs were expected to participate in ceremonies and public duties even while ill, because absence could signal weakness. Imagine a 10-year-old king expected to preside over a council meeting while feverish, or a young queen forced to attend a religious procession despite illness. Their vulnerability was magnified by the constant expectation of composure, reinforcing the harsh reality that in monarchy, even childhood sickness could become a political liability. Nutrition, though seemingly adequate, often fell short of a growing child's needs. Royal diets prioritized ceremony and status over health. Rich foods, excessive sweets, and elaborate feasts could cause digestive problems or long-term illness. Conversely, political or seasonal shortages sometimes left young rulers malnourished, further compromising their immune systems. Physical weakness made them more susceptible not only to disease but also to manipulation, as regents and advisors could frame illness as incapacity, justifying greater control over the throne. Psychological health was equally vulnerable. The stress of rulership, isolation, and constant observation could cause chronic anxiety, depression, and trauma. Young rulers were expected to navigate adult responsibilities while grappling with natural fears, insecurities, and desires for freedom. In many cases, the palace itself became a source of stress. Isolation from peers, constant monitoring, and witnessing court rivalries created emotional burdens that modern historians describe as psychological imprisonment. Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, son of Peter the Great, endured a childhood dominated by fear, suspicion, and rigid control. These pressures contributed to his eventual rebellion and tragic demise, illustrating how mental strain was as dangerous as any physical threat. Accidents and violence added further risk. In some courts, power struggles escalated to lethal outcomes, and children were not spared. Assassination attempts, poisonings, and kidnappings were tools in the arsenal of ambitious nobles and foreign enemies. Edward V of England, crowned at 12, disappeared along with his brother under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered to consolidate power. Similarly, young rulers in medieval and Renaissance Europe often faced threats not only from outside forces but from within their own families, demonstrating that vulnerability extended to every aspect of palace life. Even the natural vulnerabilities of childhood were amplified by the duties of rulership. Sleep deprivation, long hours of ceremony, and exposure to stressful negotiations weakened physical resistance. A young king expected to sit for hours in council or attend state events had little opportunity for rest or recovery. Similarly, emotional strain, such as fear of betrayal or anxiety over the loyalty of advisors, triggered physical consequences, from chronic illness to early death. The interconnection of mind and body meant that ruling as a child was inherently perilous, no matter how well protected the young monarch appeared. Certain dynasties were particularly prone to fragility due to genetic factors. Royal families often practiced consanguineous marriages to preserve bloodlines, inadvertently increasing susceptibility to disease and deformities. Habsburg rulers, for instance, faced numerous hereditary conditions that compromised both health and reproductive potential. Child monarchs born into these families inherited not only thrones but the silent burden of genetic vulnerability, a hidden threat that could devastate dynasties. Despite these risks, survival was sometimes possible, and when it occurred, it could transform fragile children into formidable rulers. Akbar the Great survived childhood illness, political chaos, and regency manipulation to become one of India's most celebrated emperors. Yet even in such cases, historians note that early exposure to mortality and fragility profoundly shaped their approach to leadership, governance, and diplomacy. The intersection of health, stress, and political expectation created rulers who were often hardened, cautious, and strategic, products of adversity rather than mere privilege. Ultimately, the fragility of child monarchs underscores one of the darkest truths of history: power was not only a social and political burden but a life-threatening one. Wealth, palace walls, and ceremonial grandeur offered little protection from the twin threats of illness and human treachery. The crown could elevate a child above peers in title and perception, but it could also shorten life, stunt development, and amplify vulnerability. Every young ruler who survived infancy did so against immense odds, navigating a world where even a fever could become a political crisis, and every cough could carry existential consequences. Understanding the fragility of child monarchs, physically, mentally, and emotionally, helps illuminate the full scope of their plight. These were children forced to endure pressures unimaginable for ordinary youth, living under conditions that combined luxury with constant peril. Their survival was not guaranteed, their reigns often unpredictable, and their legacies forever shaped by the fragility inherent to their age. In the next section, we will explore how these pressures intersected with external dangers, wars, rebellions, and political upheavals, revealing just how perilous it was to hold a throne as a child, both from within the palace walls and from the kingdom beyond. While palace walls were suffocating and dangerous in their own way, the world outside the throne offered little safety for child monarchs. Across history, young rulers were thrust into wars, rebellions, and political crises they could barely comprehend. Even when not directly commanding armies, their names and crowns became symbols for rival factions, making them targets for ambition, conspiracy, and violence. The child monarch's life was a constant balancing act between survival and legitimacy, a precarious existence amplified during times of turmoil. Consider Edward VI of England, crowned at the age of 9. The country was still reeling from the religious upheaval of his father, Henry VIII's, reign. Edward's minority became a battlefield not of swords alone but of ideas, alliances, and influence. Nobles and regents used his youth as an opportunity to push agendas. Religious reformers sought to advance Protestantism, while traditionalists resisted. The child king was nominally the head of the state, yet he had little agency. His name legitimized laws, taxes, and military campaigns, while adults pulled the strings behind the scenes. The real danger came not from enemies in distant lands but from those supposed to protect him. The child monarch existed as both a figurehead and a pawn in domestic power struggles. Wars surrounding child monarchs often took on a symbolic dimension. When a kingdom was weak or a ruler inexperienced, neighboring powers saw opportunity. Mary, Queen of Scots, became queen as an infant in 1542, and Scotland immediately became a political chessboard. England, under Henry VIII and later Edward VI, watched closely, sometimes intervening in Scottish affairs. In such scenarios, a child monarch's very existence could trigger international tension, with armies mobilized and alliances formed around their perceived vulnerability. Being a child ruler meant that personal survival and national security were inseparable, and perilous. Rebellion was another constant threat. A child on the throne often inspired factions within the nobility to rise up, believing that their youth and inexperience could be exploited. France's Louis XIV faced the Fronde, a series of civil wars and uprisings during his minority. Though only a child, his crown was a rallying point for both loyalists and rebels. The Fronde exposed young Louis to constant danger, with barricades, street fighting, and court conspiracies shaping his understanding of power and fear. These early experiences left a psychological imprint, later influencing his approach to absolute monarchy and control over the state. Child monarchs were also pressured to participate in symbolic military events, even when their age made such involvement absurd or dangerous. In some cases, they were placed at the head of armies to inspire troops or legitimize campaigns. Ancient China saw emperors like the young Kangxi forced into ceremonial command at the age of 7 during rebellion campaigns. These appearances were not tactical but symbolic, reinforcing the monarch's divine right while reminding generals and soldiers of the central authority, even if the general was a child. The danger was not only physical. Failure, hesitation, or illness during these events could signal weakness, inviting rebellion or manipulation from within the court. Political intrigue intertwined with warfare, creating a volatile mix. Child monarchs could be kidnapped, used as bargaining chips, or even executed by ambitious factions. Tsarevich Alexei Romanov's early life under Peter the Great illustrates the stakes. Though Peter sought to modernize Russia, Alexei became a focal point for conservative nobles who opposed his father's reforms. Threatened and manipulated, the young heir's life became a perilous negotiation between the demands of tradition, rebellion, and filial loyalty. For children on the throne, wars and political crises were not abstract events, they were immediate, personal threats to life and authority. Interestingly, these conflicts often accelerated the development of political acumen in child rulers, though at great cost. Witnessing rebellion, military campaigns, and the treachery of advisors forced children to learn strategy, diplomacy, and the realities of power at an age when their peers were learning letters or arithmetic. Peter the Great, despite his harsh upbringing, became a ruler known for military innovation and political savvy, shaped by the tumultuous early years he endured as a child monarch. Similarly, Louis XIV's exposure to the Fronde instilled a lifelong obsession with centralizing power and controlling his court, lessons born of fear and instability rather than education alone. Yet not every child monarch survived political turmoil intact. Edward V of England and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, vanished under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered by their uncle Richard III. Their youth made them vulnerable, and their crown made them targets. Across history, these tragic stories repeated themselves. A child's inexperience magnified danger, while their symbolic importance made them irresistible to ambitious adults and enemies alike. The line between ruler and victim was thin, and crossing it was often fatal. The intersection of war and youth also exposed the physical and emotional fragility discussed in the previous section. Constant danger, lack of control, and the pressure to symbolize authority while being powerless intensified stress and weakened resilience. Children were expected to embody courage, wisdom, and decisiveness, qualities their age had not yet nurtured. The demands of conflict, combined with illness, isolation, and manipulation, created an environment where survival was as much a matter of luck as skill. Finally, the long-term consequences of early exposure to warfare and political instability were profound. Some child monarchs emerged hardened and capable, wielding power with an iron hand in adulthood. Others carried trauma that impaired judgment or led to tragic outcomes. The young ruler's responses to political turmoil often defined entire eras, influencing dynasties, national policies, and even the course of global history. Wars and revolutions did not merely test a kingdom, they tested the child within the crown, shaping both life and legacy. In essence, wars and political turmoil made the throne an arena of danger far beyond the imagination of the general populace. For a child monarch, ruling was never just ceremonial, it was survival under constant threat. Armed with titles but rarely power, they faced rebellion, foreign intervention, and domestic intrigue, learning early that monarchy was inseparable from peril. The crown symbolized authority, but the reality was relentless vulnerability, a precarious existence where the smallest misstep could mean exile, death, or betrayal. As we move to the next section, we will uncover how this world of constant danger intersected with hidden court scandals, betrayals, and assassination plots, revealing the extreme lengths people went to exploit or eliminate child rulers. The throne, it seems, was as much a battlefield of intrigue as it was of armies and weapons. For child monarchs, danger was not limited to disease, political upheaval, or war. Behind the gilded walls of palaces lurked a far more insidious threat: human ambition. Courtiers, relatives, and even regents often saw young rulers not as heirs to protect but as obstacles, or tools, to seize power. History is riddled with scandals, betrayals, and assassination plots that turn child kings and queens into pawns in deadly games, revealing a side of monarchy that rarely appears in textbooks or portraits. Perhaps the most infamous example is Edward V of England, crowned at the age of 12. His reign was brief, shadowed by the machinations of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Initially appointed as protector, Richard gradually undermined the legitimacy of Edward and his younger brother, ultimately declaring them illegitimate and imprisoning them in the Tower of London. Within months, the boys vanished from historical records, presumed murdered, a chilling reminder that familial proximity offered no safety, and bloodlines alone could not guarantee survival. This case illustrates the lethal combination of youth, inexperience, and the high stakes of royal succession. Betrayal within the court was a common theme. Regents and advisors, who outwardly guided the child monarch, often acted in their own self-interest. Tsar Ivan IV, crowned at 3, was surrounded by boyars vying for influence. His early years were marked by manipulation, deception, and threats that shaped his psychological development, fostering paranoia and ruthlessness that later defined his reign. Similarly, the young Louis XIV of France navigated the Fronde, a series of uprisings by nobles who sought to exploit his minority. The child king was used as a symbolic figurehead in rebellion, yet the adults orchestrating the conflict often treated him as a chess piece, revealing how betrayal was not only personal but structural within the institutions of monarchy. Assassination plots were not mere legends, they were a frequent reality for child rulers. Royal life attracted envy, fear, and opportunism. Poisoning, sudden attacks, and orchestrated accidents were tools for ambitious courtiers or rival factions. In France, the young Dauphin was once targeted by a mysterious poisoning attempt, believed to be orchestrated by rival noble families attempting to influence regency decisions. Even a minor illness could be manipulated into a political weapon, with advisors using symptoms or frailty to justify changes in governance or to discredit the monarch. These threats reinforced that a child's vulnerability was both physical and symbolic, a weakness to be exploited. Political marriages, often arranged to secure alliances, could also become sources of scandal or betrayal. Young rulers were sometimes married off for political gain, regardless of age or consent, and these unions often carried hidden dangers. In some cases, spouses became agents of intrigue, introducing rival influences into the court. Mary, Queen of Scots, experienced this firsthand. Her marriages, particularly to Lord Darnley, became focal points of scandal, political maneuvering, and ultimately assassination. As a child queen, her personal life was inseparable from statecraft, and betrayal often came cloaked in the guise of loyalty or love. Even seemingly loyal allies could turn treacherous. Regents, tutors, and noble families could use their proximity to manipulate, extort, or control the young ruler. Trust was a liability, naivety was fatal. Peter the Great, as a young Tsar, witnessed conspiracies among his own family members, forcing him to develop a keen sense of vigilance and political instinct at a remarkably young age. For child monarchs, learning whom to trust was a matter of survival, and every relationship carried the potential for treachery. Scandals often extended to finances and governance. Child monarchs could be unwittingly implicated in corruption schemes, tax abuses, or secret deals orchestrated by advisors. While they lacked the capacity to fully comprehend these machinations, their names and authority lent legitimacy to actions they neither approved nor understood. This blurred the line between innocence and complicity, leaving some child rulers forever associated with scandals that were entirely the work of adults. The political and social consequences could be severe, sometimes threatening the stability of the kingdom or the dynasty itself. The psychological toll of betrayal was profound. Young rulers were forced to reconcile the duality of their world. The palace was simultaneously a sanctuary and a trap. Observing adult deceit, manipulation, and hidden agendas from an early age instilled both caution and paranoia. Many child monarchs, exposed to repeated betrayals, developed defensive, even ruthless strategies for dealing with court politics later in life. Ivan IV's infamous cruelty, for example, can be traced back to the betrayals he endured as a child. His distrust and harsh reprisals were as much a survival mechanism as an expression of power. Interestingly, not all plots succeeded, and some child monarchs survived through a combination of luck, cunning, and loyalty from trusted advisors. Akbar the Great, for instance, faced numerous conspiracies and assassination attempts in his early years. Yet through careful guidance, strategic alliances, and sheer resilience, he emerged not only alive but capable of reshaping an empire. These survival stories highlight the delicate interplay between vulnerability and adaptability. A child monarch could be both prey and predator in a court full of adults vying for influence. Ultimately, scandals, betrayals, and assassination plots were part of the hidden framework of monarchy. For child rulers, the crown was not only a symbol of authority but a magnet for danger, manipulation, and deceit. Power, for them, was as much a psychological battlefield as a political one, and survival required vigilance, instinct, and sometimes ruthless decision-making. The stories of vanished heirs, poisoned royals, and exploited children reveal that beneath the ceremonial splendor lay a world where trust was scarce and every relationship had a price. As we move into the next section, we will explore the intense pressures of adolescence under constant surveillance, examining how child monarchs navigated growing up in public, with every choice scrutinized, every word analyzed, and every mistake magnified, further revealing the extraordinary challenges of life as a young ruler. Childhood, as most people understand it, is a time of discovery, freedom, and play. For child monarchs, however, the transition from childhood to adolescence occurred under the unblinking eye of the court, transforming natural growth into a public performance. From the moment they began to understand their responsibilities, these young rulers navigated a life where every action, gesture, and decision was scrutinized, an existence that left little room for privacy, experimentation, or mistakes. Growing up in the spotlight was not just a stage, it was a crucible shaping their personalities, decision-making, and ultimately, the legacy they would leave behind. Adolescence for a young monarch was defined by an intense pressure to demonstrate competence. In many cases, this meant mastering the art of diplomacy, understanding law, and preparing to command armies long before their peers were thinking about adulthood. Louis XIV of France, who had spent his early years under the Fronde, was acutely aware of the need to project authority even as a teenager. His every word and movement was observed by regents, ministers, and foreign dignitaries. The child king learned early that appearances could be as powerful as actions. A confident posture or carefully chosen statement could signal legitimacy, while a misstep could invite rebellion or undermine his reign. The surveillance extended beyond public duties. In palaces across Europe, Asia, and beyond, adolescent monarchs were constantly monitored by tutors, courtiers, and guards. Personal conversations, private correspondence, and even casual interactions were subject to scrutiny. For many, trust became nearly impossible. Every relationship carried the potential for betrayal. Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, for example, spent his formative years in an environment where loyalty was conditional and family members themselves could be manipulated. The constant observation and lack of autonomy created a heightened sense of paranoia, making ordinary teenage rebellion or experimentation nearly impossible without political consequences. Education was both rigorous and intrusive. Adolescents were expected to excel in languages, philosophy, theology, military strategy, and statecraft simultaneously. Play and leisure existed, but these were often structured and monitored, designed to reinforce political and social lessons rather than encourage personal growth. The weight of expectation meant that adolescence, a period usually characterized by self-exploration, became a series of calculated performances. Mistakes were not merely embarrassing, they could carry political ramifications, undermine alliances, or weaken the perception of authority. The pressure to prepare for marriage and produce heirs added another layer of complexity. In many dynasties, adolescent monarchs were married off to solidify alliances, sometimes before they were fully physically or emotionally mature. Mary, Queen of Scots, experienced this firsthand, entering politically strategic marriages as a teenager. These unions were less about personal choice than dynastic survival. Young monarchs had to navigate both the public duties of a sovereign and the private realities of intimate relationships carefully orchestrated for political gain. Adolescence, for child rulers, was inseparable from obligation, often leaving them emotionally unprepared for adult responsibilities. Adolescence in the public eye also meant confronting early fame and expectation. Monarchs were elevated to almost divine status, yet this reverence was double-edged. Any display of weakness could be exploited by rivals. Henry VI of England, for instance, faced immense scrutiny as a teenager. Chronic illness, political instability, and external threats created a perfect storm in which every decision, whether ceremonial, administrative, or personal, was examined for signs of maturity, wisdom, or vulnerability. This constant evaluation created immense psychological pressure, forcing young rulers to internalize fear, caution, and strategic thinking at an age when most children are still forming basic self-confidence. Yet, adolescence also offered a chance for some rulers to begin asserting personal agency. As they matured, they could subtly influence decisions, challenge regents, or navigate court politics with increasing sophistication. Peter the Great's adolescence, though heavily surveilled and constrained, allowed him to observe the inner workings of the Russian state and the ambitions of those around him. By carefully learning, testing boundaries, and understanding loyalty and betrayal, he began to carve out a path toward autonomy. For many adolescent monarchs, these early experiences provided a foundation for leadership, even as they exacted a personal toll. The emotional consequences of growing up under surveillance were profound. Isolation from peers, constant observation, and relentless expectations created conditions ripe for stress, anxiety, and mistrust. Adolescents learned early that their instincts, emotions, and desires could be dangerous if expressed openly. This forced maturity often came at the cost of natural development, social bonding, and emotional resilience. Historians examining letters and diaries of young monarchs often note the recurring themes of loneliness, caution, and strategic calculation, traits necessary for survival but burdensome for personal growth. Ultimately, growing up in the spotlight forged both resilience and caution. Child monarchs learned to navigate complex political landscapes, read human behavior, and make calculated choices long before their peers were forming independent identities. However, the cost was high. Adolescence was stripped of the freedoms, mistakes, and exploration typical of youth. For many, the crown came with a price far greater than ceremony or luxury, the price of constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and emotional fortitude. As we move forward, we will examine how these pressures intersected with the realities of rule, showing the triumphs and failures that defined child monarchs. Some rose to greatness, harnessing early lessons of observation and strategy to leave enduring legacies. Others faltered, crushed by the weight of expectation, betrayal, and circumstance. The story of adolescence under surveillance underscores a central truth: childhood and power were rarely compatible, and survival required extraordinary strength, intellect, and resilience. The history of child monarchs is a tale of extremes. Some rose from vulnerability to reshape empires, while others succumbed to the immense pressures of the throne, leaving a trail of political instability, tragedy, and forgotten potential. Understanding these triumphs and failures offers a window into the unique challenges of ruling as a child, revealing how personality, mentorship, circumstance, and sheer luck intersected to shape the course of history. One of the most remarkable success stories is Akbar the Great of India. Crowned at the age of 13 following the death of his father, Akbar faced a volatile empire, rife with factionalism and rebellion. Guided by capable advisors and regents, he learned to navigate political intrigue, military strategy, and diplomacy with remarkable acuity. By the time he reached adulthood, he had consolidated power, implemented administrative reforms, and expanded his empire. Akbar's triumph demonstrates that, under the right circumstances, a child monarch could survive the treacherous early years and grow into a ruler whose decisions had lasting global impact. His story also highlights the crucial role of mentorship. Guidance from trusted advisors can transform a fragile youth into a formidable leader. Louis XIV of France, crowned at 4, offers another striking example. His minority was dominated by the turbulence of the Fronde, a series of civil wars and noble uprisings. Yet these early experiences of danger, betrayal, and political manipulation forged in him a lifelong determination to centralize power and control his court. When he assumed personal rule at the age of 23, he became the Sun King, one of the most absolute monarchs in European history. The lesson is clear: early adversity, when survived, could instill both political cunning and an unshakable drive for authority. Childhood hardship, paradoxically, became a tool for building extraordinary power. However, for every triumphant story, there are tales of failure and tragedy. Edward V of England, crowned at 12, disappeared along with his younger brother under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered by their uncle Richard III. Their youth made them exceptionally vulnerable to court manipulation, and their inability to assert control allowed adult ambition to dictate the fate of the kingdom. The political consequences were severe. The instability of their reign contributed to the Wars of the Roses, destabilizing England for decades. This case illustrates that the crown could elevate a child's status while simultaneously exposing them to mortal danger and the collapse of dynastic security. Failure was often a product of a combination of factors: political instability, inadequate guidance, illness, or personal temperament. Henry VI of England, crowned as an infant, faced relentless political pressure, rebellion, and chronic illness. His minority was dominated by regents and nobles who often acted in their own interest, leaving him vulnerable. By the time he reached adolescence, Henry's physical and mental fragility had already weakened the monarchy, ultimately contributing to his deposition and the continuation of the dynastic wars. Child rulers, it seems, were often condemned by circumstances beyond their control, regardless of innate ability. The role of personality in determining success or failure cannot be overstated. Some children possessed natural intelligence, charisma, or emotional resilience that allowed them to survive early pressures. Peter the Great, for example, endured extreme regency control, family intrigue, and political conspiracies during his youth. Yet his curiosity, determination, and strategic thinking allowed him to ultimately seize power and transform Russia into a major European power. Conversely, rulers lacking resilience or assertiveness were often exploited, manipulated, or destroyed, demonstrating that personal traits were as decisive as external circumstances. Mentorship and the quality of regents also played a pivotal role. Wisely chosen advisors could protect, educate, and guide a young monarch through dangerous political landscapes. Poor or self-serving mentors, however, could exacerbate vulnerability, fostering betrayal, incompetence, or instability. Akbar's survival and development contrasted sharply with Edward V's tragic end, showing how adult guidance could make or break a child's reign. The hidden influence of adults behind the throne often determined whether youthful kings and queens would thrive or perish. External pressures, war, rebellion, and succession crises, further shaped outcomes. Young monarchs often became symbols for competing factions, making their reigns inherently unstable. Those who survived early crises gained not only experience but legitimacy. Those who failed often plunged their realms into chaos, highlighting the extreme stakes involved. For example, Mary, Queen of Scots, struggled to maintain authority amid rebellions, foreign interference, and personal scandals, ultimately leading to her imprisonment and execution. Her life underscores how vulnerability, combined with external threats, could have fatal consequences. Interestingly, even failures sometimes left lessons for history. The deaths, deposals, and scandals of child monarchs highlighted structural weaknesses in dynasties, succession laws, and governance. They forced nations to reconsider regency policies, the distribution of power, and the treatment of heirs. In many ways, these tragedies shaped political thought and institutional development, influencing the governance of future generations. In the end, triumphs and failures of child monarchs were never predetermined, they were products of a fragile balance between circumstance, personality, guidance, and survival. The crown could empower a child to shape an empire, or expose them to manipulation, danger, and early death. History's record of youthful rulers serves as a testament to both human resilience and vulnerability. Children could wield extraordinary influence, yet they were also astonishingly fragile, caught between the expectations of the throne and the realities of their age. As we move to the next section, we will explore the hidden, intimate world of their personal lives, the small joys, fears, and desires that existed behind the grandeur and danger of the throne, revealing the human side of those who ruled as children. Behind the gilded halls, ceremonial robes, and unblinking eyes of courtiers, child monarchs lived lives that were far more human, and far more poignant, than the historical record often acknowledges. Beyond politics, war, and public performance, these children experienced emotions, desires, and small joys that were hidden beneath the heavy mantle of royalty. Understanding these hidden aspects offers a rare glimpse into the inner worlds of rulers whose lives were dominated by duty, danger, and expectation. Play, though constrained, existed as a critical outlet. In a time when every action was scrutinized, moments of amusement offered a temporary escape from the pressures of monarchy. Louis XIV, even while preparing for absolute rule, played strategic games that doubled as training in warfare and diplomacy. Board games, mock battles, and role-playing exercises were common tools to develop intelligence and decision-making, but they also allowed brief moments of childish joy. For many child monarchs, these games were not mere entertainment, they were one of the few socially acceptable ways to exercise autonomy, creativity, and imagination. Friendship, too, was a rare and precious commodity. Young rulers were often isolated from peers, with interactions mediated by advisors or tutors. Friendships had to be carefully navigated, as loyalty was always in question. Tsarevich Alexei Romanov's relationships within the court were limited and carefully monitored, leaving him vulnerable to loneliness and manipulation. Yet even brief bonds provided emotional sustenance, teaching young monarchs about trust, loyalty, and the complexities of human connection, lessons that would shape both their leadership style and personal lives. Emotions were often hidden behind masks of composure. Fear, frustration, or sadness could be dangerous if revealed. Advisors or regents might exploit perceived weakness. Letters and diaries from child rulers show a recurring struggle between public appearance and private feeling. Mary, Queen of Scots, recorded moments of longing and sorrow that reveal a child's awareness of isolation, danger, and the enormity of responsibility. The duality of their existence, externally regal, internally vulnerable, defines much of the tragic allure of young monarchs. Secrets played a role as well. Many child rulers developed private worlds or routines inaccessible to adults, small spheres where they could exercise autonomy. Some wrote secret journals, composed music, or engaged in clandestine study. Others maintained hidden alliances, discreetly testing loyalty and observing the ambitions of those around them. These secret lives offered a form of control in a world where nearly every other aspect of existence was dictated by others. For instance, young Akbar reportedly kept careful notes and reflections during his adolescence, learning the intricacies of governance while developing his own strategic thinking away from the eyes of his regents. Rituals and hobbies often carried dual purposes, personal enjoyment and political utility. Hunting, riding, music, or scholarly pursuits were framed as leisure but were also intended to display competence and cultivate public perception. Child monarchs were rarely allowed private hobbies purely for pleasure. Every activity was observed and interpreted, sometimes as evidence of virtue, intellect, or military aptitude. Even painting or composing music could serve as a demonstration of refinement, piety, or strategic thought, reinforcing the paradox of childhood under surveillance, personal expression intertwined with public obligation. Emotional resilience, often forged through adversity, was a defining trait. Many child monarchs learned early to navigate disappointment, betrayal, and fear. Emotional intelligence became a survival tool, knowing whom to trust, when to assert authority, and how to conceal vulnerability. Louis XIV's experience during the Fronde and Mary, Queen of Scots' early exposure to political plots shaped their capacity for strategy, empathy, and caution. For these rulers, emotional survival was as critical as physical survival, and the lessons learned in childhood often defined their adult reigns. Yet, despite these pressures, small joys persisted. Letters reveal moments of affection toward siblings, pets, or tutors. Some engaged in secret correspondence, exchanging ideas and confidences outside the formal mechanisms of court. Others found solace in religious or philosophical reflection, using meditation and prayer to navigate the weight of responsibility. These hidden moments humanized child monarchs, showing that even under constant observation and expectation, they were still children in search of comfort, understanding, and connection. The consequences of these hidden lives were profound. Emotional development, trust, and creativity were shaped under intense surveillance, isolation, and responsibility. Childhood pleasures were often transformed into tools of political education or survival. Secrets, play, and personal reflection became mechanisms to assert agency in a world where nearly every other action was dictated by adults. In some cases, this fostered extraordinary resilience and ingenuity. In others, it left psychological scars, contributing to paranoia, melancholy, or erratic behavior in adulthood. Ultimately, the hidden lives of child monarchs reveal a paradox at the heart of monarchy: the crown offered power and privilege but demanded a level of maturity, composure, and restraint far beyond the years of its young occupants. These rulers lived in a dual reality, simultaneously children and sovereigns, learners and symbols, observers and actors. Their personal joys, fears, and secrets were invisible to the world yet crucial in shaping both who they became and the history they influenced. As we transition to the conclusion, it becomes clear that the story of child monarchs is not simply one of political intrigue or dynastic struggle. It is a story of human resilience, vulnerability, and adaptation under extraordinary circumstances. Behind every crown was a child navigating a world of peril, expectation, and fleeting moments of freedom, an intimate struggle often hidden behind the grandeur and pageantry of monarchy. The lives of child monarchs did not end with adolescence or even with death. Their early years on the throne cast long shadows, influencing not only their own reigns but entire nations, dynasties, and political institutions. The legacy of childhood rule is a study in contrasts, the fragile and the formidable, the manipulated and the self-made, the tragic and the triumphant. To understand the historical impact of child rulers, we must look beyond crowns and ceremonies to the lasting consequences of surviving, or failing to survive, the pressures of monarchy. For some, early exposure to governance and crisis became a crucible for extraordinary leadership. Akbar the Great, crowned at 13, used his tumultuous youth to cultivate wisdom, diplomacy, and strategic brilliance. Similarly, Peter the Great's adolescence, marked by regency struggles and conspiracies, honed a ruthless clarity of vision that enabled him to modernize Russia and expand its influence. These rulers transformed adversity into power, demonstrating that surviving the treacherous years of youth could yield extraordinary competence and insight. Their legacies remind us that experience, even forced experience, is a teacher unmatched in shaping human potential. Yet, survival was not universal, and many child monarchs left behind cautionary tales. Edward V and his brother vanished before they could rule, leaving England in political turmoil that fueled the Wars of the Roses. Mary, Queen of Scots' early experiences with rebellion, intrigue, and political manipulation ultimately contributed to her imprisonment and execution. These tragedies illustrate how vulnerability, combined with ambition and betrayal, could reverberate across generations, shaping not only political outcomes but the very structure of dynasties. Early mortality and failed reigns forced nations to reconsider succession laws, regency policies, and the distribution of power, leaving enduring institutional lessons. The psychological and cultural legacies of childhood rule were equally profound. Many young monarchs who survived their early years carried scars that shaped their leadership styles, decision-making, and personal relationships. Fear, distrust, and caution became ingrained, often manifesting as paranoia, rigid control, or cruelty. Ivan IV's infamous reign of terror, rooted in his traumatic early years under boyar manipulation, demonstrates how the experiences of youth could echo through history, shaping both governance and the psyche of a ruler. In some cases, these emotional imprints were as influential as any political decision, altering the trajectory of entire nations. Childhood rule also shaped public perception and cultural memory. Monarchs who began their reigns as children were often mythologized, romanticized, or vilified in ways that adult rulers were not. The early ascension of Louis XIV, for example, contributed to his image as a divinely ordained ruler, while Mary, Queen of Scots' youth magnified the drama of her life in the public imagination. Art, literature, and folklore frequently emphasized the innocence, vulnerability, or precocity of child rulers, creating enduring narratives that shaped national identity and collective memory. These representations, whether accurate or embellished, reinforced the notion that monarchy itself was both awe-inspiring and perilous. Institutionally, the challenges of childhood rule led to important innovations in governance. Regency councils, advisory structures, and legal frameworks were often refined to stabilize kingdoms during periods of minority. In France, England, and Russia, the experiences of young monarchs prompted adjustments to regency laws, succession protocols, and administrative oversight. While these changes were often reactive, they also reflected a growing understanding that the vulnerabilities of child rulers required systemic solutions. In essence, the hardships of youth prompted structural evolution in governance, influencing the design of monarchy for generations to come. The stories of child monarchs also serve as cautionary lessons about the interplay of power, age, and human development. While adults around the throne often sought to manipulate, guide, or exploit, the young rulers themselves were active participants in shaping their destinies, whether through resilience, cunning, or adaptation. Akbar, Peter, and Louis exemplify the possibility of transformation through adversity, while Edward V and Mary reveal the fragility of life under constant pressure. Together, these narratives illustrate a spectrum of outcomes, highlighting the delicate balance between circumstance, agency, and historical contingency. Beyond politics, childhood rule influenced social norms and cultural attitudes toward youth. The visibility of young monarchs in public ceremonies, court life, and historical records challenged contemporary perceptions of childhood, maturity, and authority. Societies were forced to grapple with the idea that children could be both symbols and decision-makers, fragile yet powerful, innocent yet politically consequential. These paradoxes shaped not only historical memory but also attitudes toward leadership, education, and human development in broader society. Interestingly, the human side of these rulers, the hidden joys, fears, and creativity explored in previous sections, also contributed to their legacies. Letters, diaries, artistic endeavors, and personal habits provide historians with insight into the ways young rulers navigated their constrained worlds. These artifacts reveal that even under surveillance, danger, and expectation, children on the throne maintained private lives, emotional depth, and agency in small but meaningful ways. These hidden histories enrich our understanding of power, showing that monarchy is as much about human experience as it is about titles and decrees. In the final analysis, the legacy of child monarchs is both extraordinary and cautionary. They illuminate the human capacity for resilience, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the delicate interplay between personal development and political power. Their reigns, whether triumphant, tragic, or somewhere in between, offer lessons in leadership, governance, psychology, and human adaptability. They remind us that history is not simply the story of institutions and policies but also the story of individuals, often children, whose lives shaped the destinies of nations. As we move to the conclusion, it becomes clear that the story of child monarchs is more than a chronicle of power, intrigue, and danger. It is a human story, of vulnerability and resilience, isolation and strategy, secrecy and self-discovery. Their lives, lived under extraordinary circumstances, challenge our understanding of childhood, leadership, and history itself.